Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the new news. My name is Paul, and I hope that you're all having a wonderful day. I hope that you guys are safe, that your family is safe, that your friends are safe, of course. And if not, I hope they find that safety and security here in the very near future. Near future. Sorry for that. But there is a lot of people in the world that currently don't have any safety and security, and there are millions of people that need our help, not just because of the ongoing war in Ukraine, but also because of other conflicts and other different humanitarian situations throughout the world. And this includes places such as Somalia and Ethiopia, which we actually do have an update regarding today, and as well as Southeast Asia, South Africa, and many other places in the world. And we are constantly looking for additional different locations and donation locations. But please check out the description below because you're going to be able to help. And we want to be the news that gives back. We want to be, and we want to be able to do as much good in this world as we physically can. And the only way we're able to do that is with community support. So please check out the description below. Check out all the different fundraisers there. We've gone through and we've vetted these ourselves. We've gone through and made sure that these charities are legitimate, one. And two, when we're looking at different donations, we're looking for charities that provide upwards of 80% or more of their donations are actually going to their programs and not just to those salaries and administration's costs that cause a lot of controversy. So we want the majority of your donations to actually go and help people. So please check out, once again, the description below. If you can't give a lot, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, give us a like and subscribe. Not because we want to be the most popular thing on YouTube, but simply because we want to be able to do more good. And the only way we can do that is by reaching more people. And we want to be able to give people some good news, independent news. And we also want to be able to raise more money and awareness for these ongoing issues globally. Now, there has been a lot of news that came out today, a lot of stuff currently ongoing in Ukraine. And a lot of stuff globally, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to dive right into what's going on right here in our special report in Ukraine. And the first couple things we have is actually coming out of Kyiv, and that's because, as has been highly reported, there was a mass shooting yesterday in Texas, and the death toll from our last report was up to about 19. I have heard reports that number has climbed at this point, but I'm hearing different conflicting reports, so we haven't added any additional information onto that today. But President Zelensky today did make a statement on Twitter expressing his and Ukraine's condolences for the victims of that shooting and for the United States in general as we're kind of going through this difficult time. This is the second mass shooting this month. So he went ahead and made a statement there on Twitter for his condolences. So very emotional outpour coming globally regarding this situation. It's never a good situation when something like this happens, and it's called into question a lot of things. Once again, a lot of stuff that's political, which we won't get into here. But there is an outpour of support from the international community, including Ukraine, which is going through what is very much arguably a much harder time than a mass shooting in the United States. I mean, their children are dying by the hundreds in Ukraine because of the war. And we actually have some of this stuff coming from the Prosecutor General's office, who actually made statements today, a couple of different ones. They gave some rather chilling statistics, in fact. The first quote that they gave today stated that since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, Russian troops have committed 19,821 crimes against Ukraine and its citizens. This is specifically expletive to war crimes and crimes against humanity, which are currently ongoing. There's currently international efforts in order to collect evidence of this and submit it to the International Criminal Court, also known as The Hague. So that is currently an ongoing thing. And also, they made another statement stating that since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, 238 Ukrainian children have died and 433 children have been injured. Most victims among them are from the Donetsk region. So, the Donetsk region is over here in the Donbass, and this has been where the majority of the fighting has occurred. Especially over the last few weeks. We saw a lot of fighting, obviously, up in the Kyiv, Oblast, Chernihiv, Sumy, and we've seen some more activity recently up in those areas, specifically the Chernihiv and Sumy regions. But this area has been heavily bombarded for the complete duration of the war. And not only this, but the front lines here really go back all the way to 2014 during the initial beginnings of the separatist movement here in the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, which are still not fully under control by either party. But rather significant statistics coming out of Ukraine and coming from the Prosecutor General's office as they're continuing to try and find evidence of these war crimes, along with including international teams. You know, there are teams from France, the United States, and of course the United Nations also has teams there inside of Ukraine, most of which are providing humanitarian aid and assistance, but I'm sure they also have some investigative teams there on the ground as well. As we move further into the east, there's not a whole lot coming out of the Kharkiv Oblast. There is some stuff that's coming out that's a little bit older, and we see this just based off of where we know the battle lines currently are, or our best guesstimates as to where the battle lines currently are, because this is a very fluid situation. Front lines are going to change minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month, and in the event that this continues year by year. These are going to be, a lot of times, very small incremental changes. Sometimes these counteroffensives are going to be quite large. This is what we've seen so far in the Kharkiv Oblast. We just know that there is still significant combat, especially as we move further south. And moving into this, we actually get into the main topic for this report. And for the second day in a row, we're starting to see tactical withdrawals for Ukrainian forces. And this has been something that has been in question for some time now, is how long can Ukrainian troops really hold up against what is coming at them? And truthfully, it could be years. They could withstand this for years, especially as the United States continues to be, and the Western world in general continues to be supporting Ukraine. That inflow of equipment, as long as it's sustained, it means that this war could go on perpetually if need be. Now, that likely won't happen, but Ukraine still hasn't even called on their full, they haven't even drafted all of the men into the war effort yet. They have volunteer forces still, and that is what they're operating with. They haven't improvised a massive draft, even though they have retained the men in the country, and if need be, in order to do so. But this is a war of attrition, and a war of attrition means that you're grinding your opponent down to the best of your ability. Right now, we're seeing the meat grinder more swaying towards the Russian side, but Russia's bringing a lot of artillery to bear, and that really has an effect on troops, especially regardless if you're dug in or not. Artillery bombardments are something that, from personal experience, are not very fun. They're very demoralizing over time. The original term for PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, was also known as shell shock because of artillery bombardments during World War I. We're seeing a very significant number of artillery pieces being used on both sides to massive effects, a lot of saturation bombardments, which means they're just covering an entire area. And so we've seen them down here where Ukrainian forces conducted a tactical withdrawal from these locations to put themselves in better defensive positions, just because of the massive flow of Russian forces into this area and heavy combat within this region. We are starting to see Ukrainian forces seem to be withdrawing from the town of LYMAN and pushing back towards the Severodonetsk River in order to set up defensive positions. This is a lot more favorable defensively for them anyway, but it does mean they have to cede territory to Russian forces in order to... They're having to play the long game. Russia's trying to play the short game. And so in this point, we're starting to see some methodical tactical withdrawals from these areas. This doesn't mean that these troops are entirely beaten, but it does mean that they have been through the ringer. And we know that just from the video coming out today. These troops the combat is heavy, and these troops are, it's not, withdrawals aren't as clean or simple as most people think them to be. So let's go ahead and take a look here.
Давай на броню, быстрее! Давай, 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 давай! Давай! Давай, 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 давай! Давай! Нет! Идет, давай! Давай! Стой, стой, пулемет, блядь, нас зажали! Давай, давай! Стой! Бьем! Давай, 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 давай! Давай, бежим сюда! Давай, давай! Все, пацанов забрали! О! Ебать, дом взлетел нахуй! Дави, братан! На приеме, на приеме, на приеме! Я на коробочке, на коробочке! Да, плюс забрали! Я понял, мы поехали туда! Давай, давай, давай! Давай! Давай, пора подбежать! Давай, давай, давай! Давай, десь маскируй сюда, сейчас закриют! Вперед нахуй ему скажи! Давай, десь, блядь,
So we're going to cut it short, but you can get the gist as to what it's like there. These situations are extremely tense and extremely fluid. You're losing ground, you're gaining ground, you're in a stalemate, you're conducting tactical withdrawals at times because you don't want to overextend your forces and you want them to be in the best defensive position possible. What Ukraine is attempting to limit is the area that Russia controls in general, but that does mean that there are times where you have to give up your position just because it isn't advantageous. There comes a point where even if it was advantageous at a certain time, those change over time. Heavy use of artillery, it's no longer advantageous for infantry to be sitting in trenches if what's hitting them is artillery for long durations of time, to where eventually over time they just get whittled down. And we're seeing that a lot with how Russia is operating. We're seeing but we're also seeing heavy attrition rates on Russian forces as well, where they are trying to actively push into an area using their armored forces and their infantry. Their armor especially, because the armor is truly the backbone of the Russian Federation military doctrine. And we can see this even when it comes to just the general situation. That's because there's no gas running in the Luhansk region whatsoever. The reason being is these artillery strikes and these airstrikes have hit lots of critical civilian infrastructure, such as gas lines. You got to think every town has to have some kind of a main gas line that runs underneath it, and these areas are getting bombarded with artillery on the daily, hourly, really. So there's extensive damage to that kind of infrastructure. We saw the similar situation up in northwest of Kyiv, and we continue to see this in areas that are heavily affected, especially by the offensive here in the Donbass. And this is actually coming from from Sergei Haida, who is the head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration. However, once again, being a war of attrition, we're seeing a lot of destruction of enemy armor. And when I say enemy armor, I mean Russian armor. Armor forces are the backbone of the Russian Federation. That is really what their doctrine consists of. You can break Russian doctrine down into 3 different aspects. And it's a very simple 3 different aspects that has really been the mainstay of their doctrine since the Cold War. And they did sign back in, I believe, 2014. We'll have to pull it up. We do have their actual military doctrine from their embassy. But the way that the Russian military operates is they saturate an area using artillery and air assets. They work independently, saturate an area in order to soften up defensive positions, and then they use large armor columns, those massive BTGs led by tanks and BMPs and BMDs, and they roll through an area with a massive armored spearhead using infantry behind that armor in order to mop up whatever's left. That is really how the Russian doctrine works at a very, very overly simplified level. And because of this, this is why you're seeing extreme amounts of Russian armor destroyed throughout the duration of the war. And also why you're going to see Russian tanks operating very independently with what is really little to no support from infantry units. And that's because that is what the Russian doctrine actually calls for. It's more meant for the open warfare of the Russian steppe than it truly is for locations such as in areas like northwest of Kyiv, where we saw those high attrition rates. But still, in this region, it can be difficult to maneuver, but it is much more suited in the Donbass for that type of maneuver warfare. But we can see just their losses. In fact, we have 2 more additional tanks destroyed here today, as we can see in this video. These are 2 Russian tanks that were destroyed here today all along this front line. So once again, you don't see any infantry casualties nearby, and that's because when this armor is operating relatively unsupported, they're meant to go first. This even comes down to the building level of how Russia builds their vehicles. If we take a look here, you can see the troop commander hatch opens in front of the troop commander, whereas for instance NATO vehicles for the most part will open to the side or to the rear. This is in order to protect the troop commander. You see forward opening hatches on a majority of Russian and Soviet armor, as well as Eastern countries such as China, which basically all their stuff is Russia knockoffs. And we're starting to see Ukrainian jets play a much more significant role over the last few days. Whether this is just because of increased publicity or because they are more active and capable now, they're able to bring a lot of aircraft online because they were starting to receive spare parts for their aircraft. And this allowed them to bring more aircraft back up into the fight and conduct more sorties or flights in order to support ground troops, conduct, air reconnaissance missions, to, engage Russian aircraft over the skies of Ukraine. Because keep in mind, Ukrainian airspace is still heavily contested. No side maintains any dominance of the air at all, which is one of the key factors as to why we're seeing such high losses on the Russian forces side. Despite a numerical advantage, ground anti-air systems are so capable at this point that even regardless of the size of one's air force, at this point it really doesn't matter. You can maintain the skies as contested and make it very difficult for enemy aircraft to maneuver and to support ground forces. But we're starting to see more of that on the side of Ukraine today, where we're starting to see Ukrainian aircraft actually supporting ground troops and conducting close air support. Take a look here.
Я собі.
Чуєте балак?
Диван, ще одне. Красиво, красиво.
And so we've gotten that from multiple sources that those were Ukrainian aircraft operating. As we move further down here along the front, we're starting to see more evidence of that heavy usage of artillery that precedes armor pushes. We do know that they are trying to push here along the south, and actually here, I'm going to try and pronounce this town name, but Novo-Mikhailivka, where we saw what is reportedly a TOS-1A bombardment, which is the flamethrower tank or the vacuum bomb tank, those thermobaric munitions that you hear so much about. We saw several different clips, but we went ahead and picked this one. It seems to depict the situation probably the best. Before you even start here, when I'm talking saturation, look how many shell craters are in this single frame. This tells you the type and level of artillery that's being used. This is not precision weaponry. This is not precision strikes. It's not loading an Excalibur round and using a GPS to guide it into its location. They are literally building a wall of fire and lead using artillery, and they're there to flatten and demolish everything in a general area. Take take 1 square kilometer and I want you to fire as many artillery pieces into that 1 square kilometer as you can and kill everything in that square kilometer. And that is a saturation bombardment. And that's what we're seeing here. So let's go ahead and take a look. And the moisture in the air allows for, you can really see the shock waves and power coming off of these. But as you can tell, they're literally just doing, these would be what's called a linear sheaf, where they're engaging along a line. But you can truly see the power of some of these munitions that are being used on, and we can't, and well, yes, these are TOS 1A supposedly. We can't verify that, but I mean, you can understand this stuff's going both ways. There's heavy artillery being used on both sides, and that's the main heavy weaponry that Ukraine's talking about when they're saying we need heavy weapons. What they're saying is we need anti-air systems and we need lots and lots of artillery, because that is going to be what dictates winning and losing in the Donbass. And a lot of this artillery is being guided by drone systems, and we've seen heavy usage of drones on both sides, one of which being mainly the Orlan 10 surveillance drone, which is a Russian drone that allows them to both reconnoiter or to conduct recon on Ukrainian positions, and then also use it in order to dial in their artillery strikes onto Ukrainian positions. That is why it's so important and why it's so heavily posted when they shoot down an Orlan 10 drone. Now, this thing just has a Canon camera in it, essentially. But as we can see here, this one was brought down. It seems to be small arms fire because it doesn't look like they got hit with a missile, as they commonly are. But this was occurring in the Dnipro Oblast, where they had an Orlan drone that passed over, shot it down, and now that can no longer be used in order to spot Ukrainian positions and bring in artillery on them. But that doesn't mean they necessarily always need these drones, because we're seeing a lot of use of cruise missiles, and we've seen this all across the country. We've seen it even in Lviv. Really, at this point, it's more of a terror thing than it is any kind of strategic gain. There was an attack today in Zaporizhia of a cruise missile strike. We don't know the casualties. This is getting reported to us from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or sorry, Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Ukraine. This is their official Twitter. We can take a look here. So once again, another strike. Once again, we do not know the casualties of this strike. But as we've seen thus far in the war, we're seeing a lot of where this stuff is really just landing on civilian targets, including apartment buildings, and killing an untold number of civilians. Truly, the casualties of this war will be unknown, possibly for decades to come, as more and more atrocities and more of those that are missing are found. If we ever truly know the cost of the war, because that is also an unfortunate possibility that we will never truly know what the cost of the war is once it's over. And part of that reason is because of things such as forced deportation. We've heard of forced deportation before coming out of Mariupol, and according to Petro Andrushenko, he's the advisor to the mayor of Mariupol. This is the Ukrainian mayor of Mariupol. Granted, Mariupol is now under Russian control entirely, but he said on May 24th, Russian occupiers deported about 346 Ukrainian citizens, including 24 children, from Mariupol to a filtration camp in the village of Bezymin in the Donetsk region. So that is the full quote. So what a filtration camp is it was used during the First and the Second Chechen Wars. And a filtration point system, or filtration system, is actually been proven to be a war crime, or at least what is committed inside of a filtration camp or a war crime. This also goes for the isolation colony, or penal colony number 52. But you're talking about systematic beatings, rapes, torture, maltreatment of prisoners, mostly civilians, and also summary executions. So this has been tried as a war crime in the International Criminal Court. There are cases from 2000, 2001, 2002 regarding filtration point systems when they were used during the First and the Second Chechen Wars. And in Meltaball, the title I put for this is "It Belongs in a Museum." This famous line, of course, comes from Indiana Jones. And why do I say this? Because I went through and I conducted armor identification to verify that this was indeed true, because I couldn't believe it at first. They are using T-62 main battle tanks, and they're bringing them into Ukraine. The T-62 is essentially... you think the T-72 was old because it's a model variant that came out of the 70s, hence T-72. This thing's 10 years older than that is. And the thing with the T-72 is, to an extent, the T-72, because they produced an eye-watering number of them, a lot of them were still in service. They didn't produce enough T-80s, T-90s, and especially T-14s to make up for a large armored force, such as what their doctrine calls for. So they went through and they retrofitted and upgraded the T-72 to where you're seeing the B-3s, B-3Ms, BVM variants of the T-72 tank, which, for what they are relatively modernized versions of those tanks, or at least what they seem to have been. The T-62 did not receive such upgrades. They did receive minor aftermarket upgrades, and I'll actually bring up the picture here so I can show you. A key identifier of the T-62 is, one, there's handbars that are currently round the tank. On top of that, you also typically see a small bit of snorkeling gear in the back. We also see that they have no additions, or at least in this photo, I could not identify any additions for external fuel tanks to extend the range. But a couple of things that caught my eye specifically was up here by the gun mantlet, where instead of this round curvature, which you normally see with the turrets of the T-62s, you have a much more boxed front end, and that could be an indicator of additional armor plating or reactive armor that's put up there. Smoke projectors out there. Also, side skirts are something that aren't typically seen on a T-62. They normally run without them, and they were designed to be able to have them attached, but most of the time we don't see that, at least so far from other conflicts where T-62s were present, such as the Iraq wars. I did go through and identify this. This is actually something I'm a subject matter expert on, just based off of what I did in the military. I was an anti-tank missileman, so I went through and I independently verified, and I honestly can't believe it. These tanks are extremely old. They belong in a museum. I mean, this stuff is pre-Vietnam, when we don't see any of that kind of stuff rolling around, unless it's like the M16, which is already being phased out. And the M16 has gone through 4 iterations before it's even being phased out, for things such as the M4, which is a carbine version, or things such as the HK416 or the new Sig Sauer. So this tells you how bad the Russian armored forces have suffered. They're literally bringing out what should be museum pieces to fight in an active war zone in the 21st century in a tank that was designed in the 60s. This stuff, if you thought that the T-72 was outdated, this stuff is ancient. At least some armor pieces have reactive armor to them, explosive reactive armor. Some of them have a composite steel makeup. This stuff is rolled homogeneous steel. It's the same type of steel, essentially, that was used to build tanks during World War II, and all they did was they changed the size of the tank. And really, they didn't, because the LS or IS-2s and 3s were all of this similar style. So it's not that far of a departure from World War II technology, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. So with that, that is actually all the information inside of the country of Ukraine. So very interesting information coming out of the country as a whole. We're seeing, tactical withdrawals on the Ukrainian side, which definitely means losses. for the Ukrainian troops, of course, because that means that they have been hit and they've been battered to an extent to where it's no longer advantageous for them to maintain their position. But we're also seeing that attrition take its toll on Russian forces even more to an extent than we were seeing earlier. Earlier in the war, we saw it being an issue specifically with their logistical lines and having to commandeer civilian vehicles for the makeup. Now we're seeing them have to bust out main battle tanks that are far, I'd say, even obsolete completely. While still dangerous, relatively obsolete compared to what they've already been fielding. And that shows just how desperate they are to get more armor to the front to continue this. But it's a double-edged sword, because if you lost the tanks, you probably lost the crew too. And you need guys to drive the tank, and you also need fuel for the tank and the ammunition. But that brings us out to the international news now. And an interesting development coming out of Moscow today is the Armenian-Azerbaijan negotiations are going to be part of those negotiations will be occurring in Moscow next week. And this is coming from the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Andrei Rudenenko. So it's going to be the second meeting of commissions regarding the limitations of or the delimitation of the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia. This is the reason why, as we jump down here into the Middle East, there's protests that continue here in Yerevan. And the reason for this kind of situation is the fact that, so Armenia and Azerbaijan have been at war, and it's a large territorial border dispute for the most part. But Armenia, the opposition party, is currently conducting a large-scale protest because Armenia is expected to take sweeping concessions from Azerbaijan. If Azerbaijan puts it on the table, Armenia is going to accept their terms, regardless of what those terms are. That is the expectation, at least coming from the populace and the opposition right now. And that is definitely seeming to be what they are going for. While we don't know specifics regarding their negotiations thus far, that has been what the government has hinted to thus far. And so we will have to see. But today they ended up blocking the president's residence there. The protesters did. We have seen pretty significant put-downs of protesters, but it seems, at least in the last couple of days, that has lightened up a little bit. And so those protests continue as they have been for the last couple of weeks. Syria and Iraq were a little bit quiet. And while we do know that there is continuing to be a buildup of Turkish forces here in Syria, the offensive truly hasn't begun yet for the expansion of that 30-kilometer border. So there isn't a whole lot that we can report to, nor is there any much more information regarding Turkish counterterrorism operations against Kurdish forces, if you wish to call them counterterror operations, specifically in Dahuk. Up here in northern Iraq, but just in northern Iraq in general, there in Iraqi Kurdistan. However, as we push further to the east, we start to get a lot more information, and that's because here in Mazir-i-Sharif, several buses that were carrying Shiite residents were destroyed by the Islamic State. Roughly somewhere between 28 and 30 Shiites were reportedly killed and injured. 28 killed and 37 injured, according to local sources that we know of. The Islamic State did take responsibility for blowing up these trucks with at least 3 different explosives. So at least 3 different buses were hit that we know of. And so this is just a continual act of violence against members of the Shiite Islamic faith. In Afghanistan, specifically in Mazar-i-Sharif, as there's a large Shiite populace there, and it's been a target of the Islamic State multiple times before, especially in those Shiite districts. But we do have a little bit of information coming from this. And there is that Islamic State statement saying they claim responsibility for that attack. So the Islamic State has conducted many attacks over the last roughly couple of months against different populations around the world, and they seem to be really bringing back what they had in the world without having a caliphate, and that is having a large grip on a large swath of territory despite not holding it very much, but they have a very active insurgency and terrorist operations globally at this point. And at least 5 different individuals were arrested in Kabul for smuggling, specifically trying to smuggle FIM-92 Stinger anti-air missiles. These are what we've seen used to great effect in Ukraine, along with other types of anti-aircraft systems. Judging by the appearance, it's apparently looking at British blowpipe types of man pads. Either way, they were trying to sell anti-air systems, shoulder-launched anti-air systems. Originally, the Stingers were supplied to the Mujahideen by the CIA during the invasion of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. It says here that after 12 attempts to shoot down a Soviet helicopters, the militants declared their effectiveness extremely low. But the evidence that we have kind of contradicts that, just based off of the fact that Russian aircraft took so many losses that they really didn't want to fly anymore. I mean, take a look here.
بین مبارزه با جرایم سنگین وزارت امور داخله 5 تن را در پیوند به فروش و قاچاق 2 میل میزایل استینگر.
And those are indeed the British blowpipe. So those are not Stinger anti-air missiles.
بریتانیایی از مربوطات ولسوالی خاک جبار ولایت کابل در یک عملیات کشفی بازداشت نمودند. مولوی سید محمد مامور انفی رئیس مبارزه با جرایم سنگین و فساد اداری وزارت امور داخله.
So they're basically trying to sell them on the black market in other countries. That's kind of the gist there coming out of that. And the Taliban caught them. The fact that the Taliban don't know the difference between a Stinger and a British blowpipe is kind of blows my mind, considering the precursor to the Taliban was essentially parts of the Mujahideen who were operating Stingers. So, including Osama bin Laden. And as we jump across the border over here into Islamabad here in Pakistan, we can see that there were several violent clashes today amongst protests there in Pakistan because of supporters of the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan. Actually, Imran Khan came along with protesters in order to call for the resignation of the government, of the new government there. And there began violent clashes between protesters and security forces, both police and military, resulting with casualties on both sides. Now, we do not know the extent of those casualties. We just know that there were pretty extensive protests. He does have a very large backing, and really that backing is resonant because of anti-Western rhetoric, and that is that would be extremely emotionally jarring considering the events that have occurred over the last few decades there in neighboring Afghanistan. For instance, the raid to kill Osama bin Laden took place in Abbottabad, Pakistan. So this directly affected them, and so there's a lot of very charged emotions as to whether to support or to hate Western countries because of these events. And so, as you can see, it's a pretty long line of protesters. He has a very significant backing. Imran Khan has a very significant backing, but we can see some of these clashes here. So, some minor footage of those. Imran Khan is vehemently or has been very outspokenly anti-Western in his rhetoric. In fact, he said that the reason he was getting kicked out of power is because of outside influence in domestic affairs. So that is one of the reasons why there are so many protesters. He does still maintain a very large backing. He's very vocal still, and a lot of Pakistanis want him back in power, despite the new government having effectively voted him out of office with a vote of no confidence. No more news out of Sri Lanka, though chaos, I'm sure, continues there, and especially in Colombo, as the president refuses to back down. But as we jump over here into Malaysia, in Thailand, we actually start to see here in the Takbai region where militants attacked a naval base. So unidentified militants attacked a naval encampment along Takbai. There in Malaysia, and eyewitness reports say that the militants threw IEDs at the security forces and then opened fire. The shootout, or at least 3 police officers, were either injured or killed. Who's behind the attack still remains unknown, but they're asking for residents to keep calm. And we have to understand that, especially in the Philippines, Malaysia, in these areas, there are multiple different types of militant groups. But there's also a heavy amount of Islamic State activity to go along with that, though we can't verify that that's who conducted this.
Bawa tu laki itu. Laki itu. Oke.
Not where you want to be in the middle of a firefight, that's for sure. So more violence. So violence is ongoing currently there in Malaysia. However, the situation sounds like it's at least semi under control. And we actually go over here into China, because as I spoke to some extent yesterday regarding the situation in Southeast Asia, and regarding the Pacific region, specifically I talked about how the Marine Corps' doctrine is changing because it's, we're looking at doing island hopping campaigns, if need be. And because the president said that they would be supportive and they would back Taiwan with force should China attempt to invade. Today, there's reportedly a leak of audio from a meeting by Chinese military officials for planning the invasion of Taiwan. The meeting apparently occurred on May the 14th, and this has been uploaded onto YouTube. It says that it's believed to be authentic, though it cannot be independently verified, at least according to the International Business Times. But this is not something that it would be unheard of, but it would be something to hear this actual meeting. And we'd actually have that YouTube video regarding this meeting. Now it is 58 minutes long, so I'm not going to play the whole thing here because we just do not have the time for that. But it does come with subtitles, so we're going to go ahead and take at least a little bit of a look at some of this.
准备管制准备好。下面请大家投入发言。按照托育举优、精品动员作战概念引领，基于广东使命任务及3条建议：一、迅速构建军地联合指挥体系；二、统筹做好战略决胜动员准备。南海方向重点是保兵员、保前推、保装载、保航渡、保登岛。 南海方向重点是保盲区、维权益、援运输、护岛礁、 共海域。据此，我认为应当按照需求主导、统分结合。
So, if this is true, means that someone secretly recorded a very top secret meeting, but it wouldn't be unheard of. China has rather openly stated that they would be willing to take Taiwan, and they're not just willing to send every warship they have, every rowboat, fishing boat. I mean, if they had jet skis, they're willing. They will swim across the Strait of Taiwan to take Taiwan if need be. That is their philosophy. That is how much they hate Taiwan. They do not see it as an independent country. They will completely destroy political relationships for anybody who says it's an independent nation, despite the United States saying that they will, in fact, back Taiwan with military force. That is the agreement with Taiwan. The United States would intervene militarily if need be and go into direct conflict with China over Taiwan. And so this is kind of the mentality, and to hear meetings of it, while shocking to hear, is not necessarily out of the scope of possibilities or even really something new. With their rhetoric alone, there's been a plan to invade Taiwan for some time. They just keep revising it over and over and over again. The lessons that they're learning right now, they're requiring a revisitation to their plan, likely comes because of the responses that Russia is getting from Western nations in the country of Ukraine during their invasion. And this is something that was hypothesized. It cannot be confirmed to be true, but their ideologies do align. They do hold very anti-Western mentalities as nations in general, at least politically speaking. And it is believed that should there not have been a strong Western support for Ukraine because of the Russian invasion, that China may have seen that as an opportunity to then invade Taiwan, expecting no true response despite previous commitments. However, that response was extremely strong, and as we can see, China really hasn't done much other than a significant increase in incursions into Taiwanese airspace. And to talk about some of one of those very serious issues currently going on that we currently hold fundraisers for, we can see here, right here along the Ethiopia and Somali border here in Somalia. This is an article from Reuters specifically, and they titled this, I could not think of a better title whatsoever for our purposes, and that is, as hunger spreads in Somalia, babies start to die. And that is the truth. So rains have failed for at least the last 4 consecutive seasons, and that has caused the worst drought in the last 40 years. We're talking about there are more than 6 million Somalis who require international aid to survive. A lot of the food shipments and the aid shipments that were redirected to Ukraine because of the immediate issues that came with the war, especially on the humanitarian side, that food had to come from somewhere. And as has been reported by the World Food Center on multiple occasions and by the UN, the way that they're keeping people alive at this point in any kind of a capacity is they're saying they're taking food from the hungry to give it to the starving. Their words, not mine. They're taking food from the hungry and giving it to the starving. And specifically, children under the age of 5 are specifically at risk, especially in Ethiopia and Somalia and the Horn of Africa, because of these incidents. So they're expecting, the United Nations is expecting it to be comparable to the 2011 famine, where over 250,000 people died, mostly those children under the age of 5. In fact, the refugee camp there that sprung up in January now houses more than 13,000 people, and there's only enough cash for about half of them. We're talking about corpses of their animals laying in the fields and on the side of the road because they can't feed or water them and give them enough sustenance. So not only is it a drought, but now that's also food shortages as well. Millions of people have required aid in this region for decades now, and it's an issue that for the most part, has kind of fell out of the public eye because it's such a long, ongoing issue. However, there are millions of people who still require help. And that's why, regardless of what's going on in the world, we're not just looking at the conflict in Ukraine. While it would be easy to do that, and while it would be easy to build this entire channel about Ukraine and Russian relations and the issues with the West, this is a news channel, and we cannot forget about other people, the millions of other people globally. There's over 100 million refugees for the first time in history, according to the United Nations. So we can't forget about the people, not just because of the war in Ukraine, while the suffering is inconceivable because of that war, but the millions of other people, such as in Ethiopia, Somalia, Southeast Asia as well, because of the super typhoon Rai. Those efforts will take decades to help. Some of them, such as this region, just does not have a lot of stability. And while that aid has gone into these countries for decades, once again, the situation you don't want to be in is taking food from the hungry to feed the starving. And worse than that, it's not going to, no one likes to hear about the suffering of children. And in this region especially, children 5 and under are going to suffer the most out of anybody. So you can follow up with this on Reuters if you want to go and check them out. They're a very good, they're a very reliable source. We have a lot of their articles that get thrown into here just because we don't have sources for everything, and well, they have sources some places that we don't. Here in Peru, as we jump across the Atlantic, talks yield no agreement, despite ongoing talks and protests from the indigenous Peruvian communities regarding the Las Bambas copper mine. The talks today ended with absolutely no agreements, and there's a very ambitious effort to find an end, including a meeting with the president on Tuesday, but they're calling for the closure of this mine, which is a very significant economic, and a very significant economic asset, for both the world and especially for Peru. So that's why this is such a very difficult issue. It also has a lot of issues regarding indigenous peoples. Of course, there's a lot of protests. The protests are mainly from them regarding this because it is affecting their ancestral homelands. So very tough issue, but one that Peru is going to have to figure out a solution for that's going to be beneficial on both parties. And here up in the United States, the mass shootings that have occurred, especially the one at the elementary school yesterday in Uvalde, Texas, has really sparked that debate on gun control measures. And this is something that we're not going to get into the political side of this. But so far, the President Joe Biden did call for pushing for tighter gun control measures on Tuesday night. So last night we hit on that just a little bit, but we're getting this from CNBC. This is something that is already had been talked about, especially in the political campaigns, and this kind of fell by the wayside as other crises, the COVID-19 pandemic, which there have been several terrible milestones that have been set because of the pandemic. The war in Ukraine obviously took a big focus away from it. The Supreme Court issue for Roe versus Wade, that all kind of meant that this kind of an issue got put on the back burner. And we've had so far 2 mass shootings, one in Buffalo and one in Texas, Uvalde, Texas, over the last month. So that's really sparked interest politically in the United States regarding those gun control measures and really re-sparked the debate on those. And to end on an interesting light, we actually dropped down here to Argentina, where we actually found a new dinosaur. I absolutely find dinosaurs fascinating. I always have. I think anyone who's ever watched Jurassic Park, the originals, not the new weird stuff, but the original Jurassic Parks, probably find these very interesting. So it's nicknamed the Dragon of Death, and that is what this is. It's a new pterosaur species. Basically, it's a giant flying reptile. So there are 2 specimens that were found with wingspans that are measuring approximately 23 feet across, or 7 meters wide, and and the other being 30 feet wide, or 9 meters respectively. They confirmed that they are a family of pterosaur, as a dark kids. Specifically, they lived about the Cretaceous period, which is about between 146 million and 66 million years ago. So right there at the end of the dinosaur age, the Cretaceous period, right there at the end. The meteor that struck the Yucatan Peninsula that is believed to have wiped out the dinosaurs happened somewhere between 65 and 66 million years ago. So they were found during some civil construction projects about 500 miles outside of Mendoza's capital city. So very interesting, very cool. They actually have a depiction of the pterosaur here, an artistic depiction of what this may have looked like at the time. Keep in mind, these are initial looks, and these change over time. Much like we thought, dinosaurs had this very scaly skin, velociraptors, while in the 90s, like you saw with Jurassic Park, that may have been very acceptable with what was in the community. Since then, we've learned that they were very colorful, very much think of birds, but a lot bigger and a lot more deadly. That is, think of like chickens. Chickens are about the only dinosaur left roaming. They're actually the closest relative to Tyrannosaurus Rex. So, while these may be very first looks at this, it does not necessarily mean that they will be, in fact, what we find out as we gain more evidence. You can see here some of the fossil here, where they're taking some measurements of the fossilized bone there. So, of course, we're getting into some live science. They provide a lot of cool stuff, a lot of cool scientific articles for us. So, a lot of cool stuff. You can go check them out. They have all sorts of things. Medical science fields, paleontology, archaeology. Of course, a lot of stuff regarding outer space. I also highly recommend the YouTube channel Kurzgesagt. In a nutshell, they're an awesome YouTube channel. I watch them all the time, but you learn a lot from them as well. So, but with that's actually all of the news here for the day. There's been a lot that's kind of gone on. I have talked a little bit more in depth on some of this stuff than I normally do. There's been a lot of questions that have been raised over the last few days and over the last few weeks regarding a lot of these situations. A lot of this stuff becomes very frustrating as we're going through and researching it and seeing as these situations really devolve into worse and worse kind of situations. So I try to keep bias to a minimum, at least unless we have announced it like we have with Ukraine openly. But there's a lot of terrible situations currently ongoing in the world, and I think I want to try and go a little bit more in depth with some of this stuff to kind of give you an understanding as to why some of this stuff is happening, especially with conflicts such as Ukraine, and really what they're probably trying to do, at least on a tactical level, because I can at least, to an extent understand that based off of just my professional background. But with that is actually the end of the news. And as we talked about today, there are millions of people that are suffering throughout the world. And that doesn't mean there's nothing that we can do. Everybody can do something. We want to be the news that gives back. And please check out the description below and check out the different fundraisers, not just for Ukraine, but for the millions of other people that are in places such as Ethiopia and Somalia and Southeast Asia, because we can't forget about them despite whatever else is going on in the world. Ukraine is the big focus in the news right now, but that doesn't mean other people stop needing things because there's a war going on. These people will always need support in some way, shape, or form, and there will always be other crises that pop up as time goes on. So if you can't give a lot, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, give us a like and subscribe, because the more people we can reach out to, and the more people that come here and come here, watch the news, get some independent news, get away from that the mainstream media there a little bit. The more people that come and see this channel can see what we're trying to do, and can also go and donate and support these ongoing efforts to help people globally. And in a time like this, where a lot of stuff is being diverted to Ukraine, places like Ethiopia, Somalia, and Southeast Asia need it more than ever. So please tell your friends, like, subscribe, donate if you can. And with that, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your evening. We'll be streaming once again tomorrow. I hope that you remain safe, that your family and friends remain safe. If not, I hope that they find that safety and security in the very near future. I hope that we end up having some more good news, and that we end up getting a little bit less depressing stuff as time goes on, and hopefully we get some much more uplifting stuff in the future. And I hope that you guys will be back to join us once again tomorrow as we continue this endeavor. And with that, my name is Paul over here at the Noon News, and I hope to see you guys tomorrow. Have a great and wonderful night, and have a wonderful Thursday. Talk to you guys later. Bye.